I'm going to be presenting some work I've been doing with Kayla Brewer and Heather Price, looking at child witnesses' disclosures to peers. And in particular, we were interested in methods for promoting truthful disclosures from both the child witnesses and peer disclosure recipients. So there's a host of literature suggesting that peers are common recipients of disclosures about negative events such as abuse, especially as children reach adolescence. This has largely been self-report, looking at who children first disclose to. And what we were interested in was, after a child receives a disclosure from their peer, what does that disclosure recipient do? And in particular, do they take that disclosure and later disclose to an adult themselves? So the first study that I'm going to present today specifically looks at this question. First, whether children disclose to a peer about an adult's transgression, and whether that peer disclosure recipient would then go on to disclose to an adult. And we can see how this could be particularly important when we're thinking about child abuse cases and having multiple disclosure recipients. So the first study that I'll briefly touch on today, we had 350 children. Half of the children were participating in a paradigm where they were a witness to a transgression. So there was a bunch of science activities they were participating in. And during that, one of the Confederates spills water on a laptop, ruining the laptop. That's her boss's laptop. And she asks children not to tell anyone or she might get into trouble. Following this science experiment activity, the children were then paired with a peer, and the peer was naive to the event, and the peer interviewed the child about what happened. The following day, both the witness and the peer then spoke to an adult about the event. And we were interested in whether both the witness as well as the peer, whether they would disclose the adult's transgression of spilling water on the laptop to the adult. What we found in this first study was that on day one, the witness disclosed to the peer about 40% of the time. On day two, when interviewed by an adult, the witnesses, about half of them reported to the adult. In contrast, when the peers were interviewed by an adult, we found that 87% of them reported the transgression to an adult. So a really high rate of disclosure from the peer disclosure recipients. So given that both witnesses and importantly, the peer disclosure recipients are potential reporters, we were interested in our second study in examining possible methods for increasing the disclosure rate of both the witnesses and the disclosure recipients. Now, there's been a substantial amount of work that's has been dedicated to overcoming children's reluctance to truthfully tell about an adult's negative transgression or event. And one approach that's been found to encourage disclosure from reluctant children involves suggesting an interviewer's implied knowledge about the event. So there's been a few studies that have looked at this. One by Fu and colleagues, where a child transgressed and they manipulated whether the interviewer bluffed about having access to the information and it looked really false, or whether it looked like they had real access to the information about whether the child transgressed. And they found that children varied whether they disclosed based on the interviewer's perception of knowledge about the transgression. Another series of studies have looked at the putative confession. And the putative confession is a technique that has been found to increase disclosure rates of children 10 and under, where the child has transgressed with a co-transgressor, an adult, and the children are told that the adult has confessed and they want the child to tell the truth. So it implies that the interviewer already has access to this knowledge and information. However, this technique has been critiqued in that it is suggestive and also uses deception with children and shouldn't be implemented. And so we were interested Given that this does have positive effects in increasing children's disclosure rates, we were interested in seeing if we could find a technique that was less deceptive, but still used this implied knowledge piece in this peer context. So we were interested in the peer implied knowledge technique, where after discussing the transgression with a peer, we were interested whether knowing that the partner or the peer is being interviewed by an adult, whether that influences the willingness of the peer to disclose. So how we did this was that we had 400 children, again, from a summer science camp, and we divided these children into two different groups. We had our witnesses and our peer interviewers. The witnesses witnessed an art show or a science art show, again, where a bunch of science experiments were happening, and our Confederate spills water on the laptop and confesses that it's their bosses and that they're going to be in so much trouble. Please don't tell anyone that they've spilled water on the laptop. The other half of our children are our peer interviewers. So they weren't present during the event. And they were told during this time that their job is going to be to find out what happened while they weren't in the room, and learn about what the children were doing with the science experiments activities. We then paired the witnesses and the peers together. We tried to match them as closely on age, and we matched them based on gender. And then the peers were set off to interview the witnesses however they so chose, to try and make it as naturalistic as possible on how children would have those conversations. The next day, both the child witnesses and the interviewers, my animation's slightly off here, were paired with adults. So they were all interviewed by an adult on the second day, and they were in one of three conditions, either the verbal plus visual, or the control condition. So in the verbal condition, what we did is we explicitly told them that we were going to be interviewing the child they spoke to the day before. So we said, we're going to talk to everyone about what happened yesterday when the visitors came, including the child you talked to yesterday. So making it clear that we're going to have access to that information. We thought, well, what if we make this maybe a little bit more salient to them? So not just verbally telling them we're going to talk to the other child, but also allowing them to visually see that we're talking to the other child at this time as well. So our verbal plus visual condition, we made that same verbal statement, but we also pointed to the fact that we are currently interviewing them. So they were in eyesight of the other child, but far enough away that they couldn't hear what was being said in the other interview. And then finally, in our control condition, neither of these manipulations happened. The adult interviews were much more structured than the child interviews, of course. The structured interview went from a free recall phase where we asked them to tell us everything that happened, followed by encouraging them to sequence the event with the first thing that happened, followed by what happened next prompts. And then we moved to more of a cue recalled, where we asked them to tell us everything the visitors said, everything they said to their friend, tell me everything you said to your parents, and then a much more directed question about, did the visitors ask you not to tell anyone what happened? So both of the day one interview and the day two interviews were audio recorded, and then we coded for a number of factors, including whether or not they disclosed, the type of disclosure, so whether they fully disclosed the transgression, that water spilt on the laptop and it broke, whether they partially disclosed this, so water spilt and we couldn't finish the activity, or whether there was a non-specific disclosure. So this would be children saying something like, something bad happened. We also coded for the time to disclosure because we were interested in whether perhaps there was no differences in whether they disclosed across conditions, but perhaps one of the conditions might decrease reluctance a little bit more than the others, increasing their time to disclosure. So what did we find? So on day one, looking at whether the witnesses disclosed to the peer about the transgression, we found that almost half of participants disclosed to the peer, so a similar rate to our study one. And when looking at the type of disclosure, we saw that the majority of the disclosures were partial disclosures. So about 60% of them were partial disclosures, and only a third of them were a full disclosure about the water spilling on the laptop and it breaking. So partly disclosing what happened. On day two, we were interested in, when they were interviewed a second time by the adult, whether or not they would disclose to an adult. And here, unlike study one, we did find an increase in disclosure rates. So 77% of them did disclose to an adult on day two across the three conditions. And we found a similar pattern in terms of the type of disclosure. So no difference from the peer disclosures. Majority of them were partial disclosures, with a third of them being a full disclosure. So the next piece is whether that honesty promotion technique actually worked with the witnesses. What we found was, in fact, did not work. Unfortunately, there were no differences between the verbal visual, and the control condition in terms of the rate of disclosure. We found relatively high rates for the witnesses across all three conditions. So we thought, well, we'll look at the time to disclosure. Maybe there's something here. Again, there was no differences in the time to disclosure. And in case you're wondering, there was also no differences in the type of disclosure, whether it was a partial or a full disclosure. So nothing to write home about in terms of honesty promotion for the witnesses. So let's move to the peer interviewers. So the peer interviewers were looking at whether they're disclosing to the adult on day two. Remember that only 47% of our peer interviewers received a disclosure on day one, and we were particularly interested in the transmission of that disclosure. So we only looked at that 47%, which gave us an N of 74. So it gets a little bit smaller here. Of those children who received a disclosure, we found that the majority, 72% of them, transmitted that to an adult on day two. And similar to the witnesses, they were mostly partial disclosures, although at a slightly higher rate than the witnesses, and a quarter of them were full disclosures. In terms of the honesty promotion technique, due to the low sample size of children in this recipient group, we were limited in what statistical analyses could be reliably run, since we only had that N of 74. Luckily, they were relatively equally distributed across our three conditions. So to provide some insight into the transmission differences across conditions, we did look at proportional differences and found that peer recipients who were in the verbal condition were twice as likely to transmit the disclosure compared to children in the control condition, and children in the verbal plus visual were 1.3 times more likely compared to the control condition. So there appears to be maybe some whispering of an effect here with our interviewers or our child recipients. We also looked at time to disclosure and the type of disclosure, and we found similar patterns across the three honesty promotion conditions. So no differences there, unfortunately. So what do we see overall? We saw that children do disclose to peers, and that peer disclosure recipients are willing to transmit that disclosure to an adult. And while the honesty promotion conditions of implying knowledge didn't influence our witnesses, there were some suggestions that it may influence peer recipients' willingness to disclose an adult's transgression. And I just want to throw in a few caveats here and thinking about whether we throw all of this out or whether we continue looking at these types of honesty promotion techniques. First, perhaps it's more effective when children are much more reluctant to disclose. So here we're seeing that children were disclosing an adult's transgression. It wasn't a very serious transgression. Perhaps if the transgression was more severe, or like previous studies, children were involved in that transgression, we might find an effect of these honesty promotion conditions. So something to look at in the future. And the other thing to think about is our control condition, and what was it really a control condition in this study? The study was done at a camp, so kids were coming in and out participating in the research study, even in the control condition. While we didn't make it explicit to them that we were interviewing the other children, it may have been implied since the other children were being pulled out of the camp to participate. So perhaps if we had a more pure control condition, we might have seen significant differences between the control and our implied knowledge conditions. So something to look at in the future. So I would encourage continuing to look at the implied knowledge techniques with children to encourage disclosure rates. Thank you.